They thought they could humiliate Chuck Norris right there on the road. They pinned him against his truck, laughed and threatened him with a gun. But within seconds, everything turned against them. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The California desert stretched out endlessly, a vast sea of dust and fading color beneath the last blush of the sun. The horizon glowed with streaks of orange and violet, and the heat that had shimmered on the asphalt all day was beginning to soften, though the scent of scorched earth and dry grass still clung to the air. A long ribbon of cracked highway cut through the emptiness, and along it rolled a weathered but well-kept Ford F-150 pickup, its engine a steady hum that blended with the silence of the land. Behind the wheel sat Chuck Norris, his face turned slightly toward the horizon, his expression calm, his eyes narrowed against the light of the dying sun. He had always loved this road. It was quiet, removed from the rush of city life, a place where the noise of the world melted into the background and left him alone with his thoughts. After hours spent in the dojo, teaching students how to stand, how to breathe, how to defend themselves without losing their humanity, this stretch of highway felt like a sanctuary. He wasn't simply driving home. He was allowing the desert itself to cleanse him of the day's intensity. The training session had been a good one. The younger students, eager but restless, had tested his patience. But Chuck had seen the spark in their eyes, the same spark he'd once carried, the desire to be strong, to feel unbreakable. He knew that beneath the surface of their bravado, each of them longed for discipline and purpose. He had reminded them that martial arts weren't about fighting. Not really. They were about control of the mind, the body, and the heart. He had told them that real strength wasn't measured by how hard you could hit, but by how much you could endure, how much you could walk away from without losing your dignity. Those words still lingered in his mind, resonating with the rhythm of the truck's engine as the road unspooled before him. He shifted slightly in his seat, the worn leather creaking under his weight. His pickup wasn't flashy, not like the machines younger men drove, but it was steady, dependable like him. Every dent on its surface carried a memory, every scratch a story. He smiled faintly, remembering the day he had bought it. He could have afforded something newer, something sleeker, but that wasn't him. Chuck had never cared for the shine of appearances. He cared for what lasted, what could be trusted. The breeze from the open window carried the smell of sagebrush and gasoline, mingling with the faint strains of country music on the old radio. He tapped the steering wheel lightly, not in rhythm but in thought. At his age, most men would have surrendered to quiet lives, perhaps fishing on weekends or sitting on porches with fading eyes. But not him. His body was slower, yes, but sharper too. Like a blade honed by decades of combat and discipline, he still moved with the precision of a predator, his reflexes a constant reminder of the life he had lived and the skills he had mastered. As the truck carried him further into the desert night, his thoughts wandered. He thought of the students he had taught, the ones who had come to him broken and left stronger. He thought of the times he had faced real violence, not the stage battles of the silver screen, but the kind where men bled, where choices were final, where hesitation meant death. He remembered those nights vividly, and though he bore the weight of them, he never regretted the path he had walked. His life had been forged in fire, and it was that fire that kept him alive. The hum of the tires against the cracked asphalt lulled him into a state of calm vigilance. He was always alert, always scanning without realizing it. Years of training and survival had ingrained in him an awareness that never faded. So when a faint glare appeared in his rearview mirror, a pair of headlights cutting through the dusk, he noticed immediately. At first there was nothing unusual. Cars appeared on highways all the time. But as the minutes passed, he realized this one wasn't passing, wasn't keeping a steady distance either. The vehicle behind him, a dark SUV, its paint hard to distinguish in the twilight, drew closer, its headlights washing over the back of his truck, forcing him to squint. He adjusted his mirror, keeping an eye on the approach. The SUV trailed him tightly, its movements deliberate, not the casual wandering of another driver. Chuck's jaw tensed. He eased his foot slightly off the accelerator, dropping his speed. The SUV mirrored him, staying close, its lights glaring into his mirror like the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey. For nearly a mile it shadowed him. The desert remained silent, the only sound the thrum of engines and the faint whistle of wind through open windows. Chuck felt the shift in the air, the kind of subtle change that years of instincts never ignored. He knew harassment when he saw it. This wasn't coincidence. Whoever was in that SUV was making a choice, and it wasn't a friendly one. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles pale against the fading light. A calm settled over him. Not fear, never fear, but readiness. He had been in too many situations where danger lurked behind a smile or a shadow to mistake what was unfolding now. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, his mind already walking through possibilities, measuring responses, cataloging strategies. The SUV suddenly accelerated, swerving slightly into the next lane, then cutting back behind him, the way a wolf circles prey before lunging. Chuck narrowed his eyes. The driver was baiting him, testing him, trying to provoke a reaction. He refused to give them the satisfaction. He kept his speed even, his truck steady, his gaze fixed forward. But inside, his instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. He could almost feel the intent bleeding from the SUV, the weight of aggression pressing against the back of his neck. He knew the road was too empty for this to be anything but personal. They wanted him to stop. They wanted confrontation. The SUV crept closer still, the lights blinding, the engine roaring as it surged forward, nearly clipping his bumper before dropping back again. Chuck's breathing remained calm, measured. He wasn't rattled, but he knew what was coming. He'd seen it too many times before. Men who mistook cruelty for power, who believed intimidation could bend others to their will. The desert stretched out endlessly before him, silent, indifferent, as the predator at his back closed in. He adjusted his posture slightly, shifting in his seat, his senses sharp as glass. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came, he would be ready. Always ready. The SUV surged forward again, this time pulling alongside his truck. Through the tinted windows, he caught glimpses of movement shadows inside, figures leaning, one arm waving mockingly. He didn't respond, didn't even glance in their direction, though he felt their eyes locked on him, probing, searching for weakness. He kept his truck steady in its lane, but his heart rate, though calm, was prepared for what was inevitable. Then with a sudden swerve, the SUV shot ahead, cutting into his lane and braking hard, forcing him to slow sharply. Dust rose from the roadside as he guided his pickup safely to the shoulder, his reflexes smooth, controlled. The SUV stopped just ahead, blocking the road, its brake lights glaring red like warning beacons. Chuck put his truck in park, his gaze fixed on the vehicle before him. He exhaled one last calm breath, the kind of breath that precedes storms, and knew the peace of the desert had just shattered. The stillness of the evening gave way to a new reality. The hunt had begun, and whether they knew it or not, these men had chosen the wrong prey. He opened his hand once, feeling the stiffness in his knuckles, and placed it calmly back on the wheel. His eyes hardened as he watched the SUV doors begin to open. The night was no longer quiet. It was waiting. And so was he. The air was no longer still. Dust curled up from the roadside as Chuck eased his truck to a halt, the engine idling softly, the growl of the pickup swallowed by the heavier, more aggressive rumble of the SUV just ahead. Its brake lights glowed like hot coals, illuminating the cracked asphalt in an angry red. For a long moment, nothing happened. Only the sound of both engines filled the desert night. Two predators circling without yet striking. Chuck sat behind the wheel, his hands steady, his breathing even, his eyes fixed on the shadows moving inside the dark vehicle in front of him. He knew this wasn't random. He knew exactly what this was. The doors of the SUV swung open almost in unison, and three figures emerged into the cooling air. They were young, recklessly young, with the kind of swagger born not from real experience, but from the arrogance of men who had never truly been tested. They smelled of cheap beer and cigarettes even from a distance, their movements loose and careless. But in their eyes, which glimmered faintly under the SUV's interior light, was a sharpness that only came from the thrill of domination. They weren't here to chat. They were here for sport. The first one, tall and wiry, held up a phone. The glow of the screen lit his face with a ghostly pallor, and he immediately pointed toward the truck, chuckling. "Here we go, boys," he said, his voice pitched high with excitement. "This is the one. Let's get it all on camera. The world's gonna love this." He wasn't talking to Chuck. He was talking to an imagined audience, to the friends he'd show later, to the internet he hoped to entertain with humiliation. The second, broader across the shoulders with a shaved head gleaming under the moonlight, smirked as he adjusted his leather jacket and strode closer. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice coated in mockery. "What do we have here? Grandpa driving his retirement wagon down our road." He laughed, and the sound was empty, forced, as though he was playing a role he'd rehearsed too many times. He circled slightly, his steps slow and deliberate, eyes locked on Chuck like a hyena circling a lion it thought might be too old to fight back. The third stayed a step behind, and when his hand slid into his waistband and reemerged holding a pistol, the atmosphere shifted. The dull gleam of metal under the dim light stripped away whatever childish prank they had pretended this was. His grin was sharp, his voice low and dripping with menace. "Don't get any ideas, old man," he said, lifting the weapon just enough to show it, not enough to point. "This is just a little talk. You play nice, you'll be fine." Chuck didn't move. He sat as though carved from stone, watching them approach through the windshield. His jaw was set, his eyes unwavering. Inside, his mind was clear, calculating distances, noting positions, recognizing threats. He saw the phone, the weapon, the angle of their shoulders, the way their weight shifted on their feet. He noted which hand each man favored, how they carried themselves, where their balance faltered. Every detail entered his awareness, filed neatly away. To the three young men, he might have looked passive, even weak, but within him the storm was already forming, silent and patient, waiting for its moment. The one with the phone gestured toward the truck, laughing as though this were a stage. "Come on out, old-timer," he sneered. "Show us that famous cowboy swagger. Or do you need us to help you out?" His laughter mixed with the second man's, a chorus of ridicule that echoed too loud against the empty night. The broad one, emboldened by the moment, stepped forward and yanked open the driver's side door. The hinges groaned, the smell of sweat and cheap cologne wafting into the cabin as he leaned in. "Come on, Grandpa," he said, his voice harsher now. "Out of the truck." His hand clamped onto Chuck's shoulder with mock familiarity, the grip hard enough to bruise. "Don't make us drag you." Chuck turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on the hand gripping him. The veins stood out against the younger man's pale skin, the knuckles white with pressure. For a fraction of a second, Chuck considered ending it right there. A twist of his wrist, a shift of his elbow, and the man would be on the ground screaming. But it wasn't time yet. He exhaled slowly, unbuckled his seatbelt, and slid out of the truck with deliberate calm. The night air hit his face, cooler now, carrying with it the faint hum of crickets and the endless smell of dry earth. Standing upright, he seemed taller than the men expected, his frame still broad, his presence heavier than they had imagined when they first decided to target him. Yet they masked their unease with laughter and mockery. "Look at him," the one with the phone jeered, angling for a better shot. "Mr. Action Star himself. Where's the roundhouse kick, huh? Where's the karate chops?" He laughed so hard he doubled over, his voice cracking. The one with the gun finally raised it higher, the barrel glinting faintly in the light. He stepped forward, pressing close, his voice dropping to a growl. "Hands on the hood," he ordered. "Face down. Now." Chuck complied without a word, his palms pressed against the warm metal of his truck's hood, the faint heat from the day still lingering in the steel. His reflection in the windshield stared back at him, calm and unbroken, as the broad one shoved his shoulder again, pressing his chest forward. "Not so tough now, are you?" the broad one whispered near his ear, his breath sour with alcohol. "All those movies, all that tough guy crap, and here you are, bent over your own rusty truck. Bet it doesn't feel so good." The phone hovered inches from his face, capturing every second. The laughter behind him was cruel, hollow, the kind of laughter that tried to drown out insecurity. The gun pressed lightly against his side now, the weight of it undeniable, the threat plain. "You hear me, old man," the one with the gun snarled. "We own this road. We own you. All it takes is one twitch of my finger, and your story ends right here, forgotten in the dust. Chuck's breathing did not change. His heart did not race. His body remained still, but his mind was alive, sharper than any blade. He could feel the exact angle of the pistol against his ribs, the shift of weight in the man's stance, the overconfidence in his voice. He could sense the distraction in the one holding the phone, who was too busy laughing to watch carefully, and the impatience in the broad one, whose grip on his shoulder was sloppy, unrefined. He waited. He let them press their advantage. Let them believe they had won. To them, it was victory already. To him, it was only a stage being set. The desert held its breath, the night air thick with tension, and somewhere in the distance a lone coyote howled as if warning of the storm that was about to break. The humiliation was sharp, intentional, designed to break him down. But Chuck Norris did not break. He had endured worse in places far darker than this lonely stretch of road. He had stood against men far more dangerous than these reckless boys. His silence was not surrender. It was a decision, deliberate and cold. Behind him, the phone clicked as the recording continued. The boy's laughter cutting through the night like broken glass. The broad one shoved harder, pressing his cheek closer to the hood. The gunman snarled another threat, and for a moment they truly believed they had caged the lion. But the lion was only waiting. The hood of the truck was still warm against Chuck's palms, the metal carrying the heat of the long day. The sour breath of the man behind him mixed with the bitter stench of cigarettes, each shove against his shoulder intended to humiliate, to drive the point home that they believed him powerless. The laughter of the one with the phone carried on in short, sharp bursts, the kind of laughter that revealed its own nervous edge, though none of them realized it, and the gun pressed just firmly enough into his ribs to remind him that any mistake would carry a price. To them, this was victory. To Chuck, it was merely the moment before lightning split the sky. He did not allow his breathing to change, did not tense his muscles prematurely, did not shift his weight in a way that could warn them. His years of training had taught him that the most dangerous opponent was the one who seemed utterly calm, and in this moment, he played that role with perfection. Inside his head, though, every detail was measured and filed away with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. The one with the phone was standing at a diagonal angle, his balance uneven, one leg behind him for show more than stability. The broad-shouldered one pressing him down leaned too much into the motion, overcommitting. His weight pitched forward, and the gunman, despite his arrogance, kept the weapon too close, the barrel angled carelessly against his side, rather than secured in a dominant position. Every mistake they made was an opening. "Say something, Grandpa," the one with the phone jeered, thrusting the device closer to Chuck's face. "Say hi to the camera. Tell everybody how it feels to get owned by the next generation." His laughter was forced, jagged, meant to cover the flicker of unease that already stirred in him. He was still too foolish to listen to it. Chuck kept silent, his eyes fixed on his reflection in the windshield. He barely recognized the calm face staring back at him, so devoid of emotion it could have been stone. His silence worked on them in ways they didn't understand. It gave them confidence, yes, but it also unsettled them. They mistook it for submission, but some part of them, buried deep under bravado, began to sense the storm they were calling upon themselves. The broad one sneered, tightening his grip on Chuck's shoulder. "Nothing to say? That's what I thought. All washed up, just another old man hiding behind a rusty truck." He shoved him harder, the smack of Chuck's chest against the hood ringing louder than it should have. "Come on, cowboy, where's that fight? Where's the legend now?" The man with the gun leaned closer, his words a venomous whisper in Chuck's ear. "I could end you right here. Just one twitch, and you'd bleed into the dust. Maybe I should. Maybe we'll see how tough you really are when you're crawling on the ground." It was then, in the instant the man finished his threat, that Chuck moved. The transition from stillness to violence was so sudden it seemed unreal. His elbow shot backward, a blur of motion honed by decades of repetition, connecting with the wrist that held the gun. The weapon jerked free, clattering against the asphalt with a hollow clang that echoed into the night. Even as the gunman staggered back in shock, Chuck's body twisted with fluid precision. His opposite hand snapped upward, knocking the broad man's grip from his shoulder, and in the same motion, his legs shot out with the speed of a coiled spring. The kick connected with the man's knee, a sharp crack splitting the air as he collapsed with a howl, sprawling into the dirt. The one with the phone barely had time to register what had happened. His laughter died mid-breath, replaced by a startled gasp as Chuck pivoted toward him. The phone was still raised, capturing the chaos. But before he could lower it, Chuck's hand lashed out, striking the wrist with a controlled snap that sent the device spinning into the darkness. The young man yelped, his fingers instinctively clutching at the sudden pain, and in that heartbeat of hesitation, Chuck stepped into his space, a shoulder strike slamming into his chest. The impact stole his breath, folding him backward onto the asphalt. The gunman roared, scrambling toward the weapon on the ground, but Chuck was faster. He swept his leg in a low arc, catching the man squarely at the ankle and sending him crashing down face first onto the road. The gun lay inches away from his outstretched hand, but before he could grasp it, Chuck's boot came down with deliberate force, pinning the weapon against the pavement. His eyes, cold and sharp, met the young man's in the dim light. For the first time that night, the bravado in the man's gaze faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. The broad-shouldered one groaned from the dirt, clutching his leg and cursing through clenched teeth. The one with the phone rolled onto his side, gasping for breath, disbelief written across his face, and the gunman, pinned beneath the weight of Chuck's boot, no longer looked so sure of himself. In less than 10 seconds, the balance of power had shifted entirely. "You thought I wouldn't fight back," Chuck said, his voice steady, low, controlled. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His words carried the authority of a man who had seen more violence than these boys could imagine. "You thought this was a game." The silence that followed was heavier than the desert air. The laughter, the jeers, the mockery, all of it was gone, replaced by the sound of their ragged breathing and the faint hum of crickets in the distance. Chuck released the gun, kicking it further out of reach before stepping back. His body was still, but the readiness hadn't left him. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, sharp and clean, yet his mind remained as steady as his breathing. The man with the phone tried to crawl toward the edge of the road, mumbling curses under his breath, but Chuck's voice stopped him. "Stay down." The command was quiet, but it froze the boy in place. The broad-shouldered one rolled onto his side, glaring up through the pain in his leg. You think this is over?" He spat, his voice cracking with defiance that didn't match the tremor in his hands. Chuck's gaze bore down on him, unflinching. "For your sake, it better be." The night had changed. Where moments before these three had been predators circling prey, they now lay scattered in the dust, their confidence shattered, their power stripped away. The desert, which had watched silently, now seemed to breathe again, the tension breaking in the wake of the storm. Chuck took one step back toward his truck, his eyes never leaving them, every movement deliberate. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. He knew men like this, knew the arrogance that clung even after defeat. They would try again. They always did. And when they did, he would be ready. For now, though, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of their own fear press down on them. He had struck like lightning, and in its aftermath, he wanted them to feel the thunder. The broad one groaned again, clutching his knee. The gunman spat blood onto the asphalt, glaring up with a hatred that barely masked his fear. The one who had been filming whimpered softly, the bravado drained entirely. Chuck remained still, his posture relaxed but his body alert, every muscle coiled and ready. He had not unleashed everything he could. He hadn't needed to. What they had seen was only a glimpse, a warning. And as they struggled to understand what had just happened, Chuck knew with certainty the real fight hadn't even begun. For a long breath, the desert itself seemed to pause, as if even the crickets and the whisper of the wind held their voices in the wake of what had just happened. The three men who only moments earlier had been so loud, so sure, so eager to humiliate, now sprawled across the roadside like children caught in a storm, too fierce to endure. Yet Chuck knew this was not finished. He had seen the flicker in their eyes even as fear cracked through their bravado. That flicker was pride, the kind of wounded arrogance that refused to yield even in the face of absolute defeat. Pride was more dangerous than any weapon because it compelled men to rise long after they should have stayed down. The gunman was the first to move, his face twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief. He spat into the dirt, pushing himself up onto his elbows, his breath ragged. His eyes darted to where the pistol had skittered across the asphalt, lying half under the shadow of the truck. He thought he was subtle, thought Chuck's attention was elsewhere, but Chuck had already seen the twitch in his gaze, the tightening of his jaw, the slight shift in his shoulder as he prepared to lunge. "Don't!" Chuck warned, his voice carrying no more weight than a whisper. Yet it cut through the air like steel. The young man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his body taut, his pride screaming louder than his reason. Then he lunged anyway. He scrambled across the gravel, reaching for the weapon. But in the same instant, Chuck moved. His boot struck out, precise and swift, sending the pistol skittering further beneath the truck, well out of reach. The blow caught the man's wrist in passing, a sharp crack of bone against bone that made him yelp and clutch at his arm as he rolled onto his side in pain. The broad-shouldered one, grunting and clutching his leg, pushed himself upright with a snarl. His knee bent awkwardly, his weight unsteady, but his fury was stronger than his body's warning. He staggered forward, swinging his fist wildly. "You think you're tough?" he roared. The punch came in clumsy, telegraphed, the kind of strike Chuck had seen 1,000 times in 1,000 back alley fights. He didn't bother blocking with force. Instead, he sidestepped, his body flowing like water, his hand catching the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The broad one gasped, his own momentum dragging him forward, and with a smooth shift of weight, Chuck drove him into the side of the truck. The thud rang hollow, rattling the metal. The one with the phone, trembling but still too stubborn to flee, scrambled up from the ground. His chest heaved, his laughter long gone, his voice breaking as he shouted, "We're not afraid of you!" He rushed forward with a desperation that spoke more of panic than courage. Chuck let him come, measuring the angle, the speed, the sloppy forward charge of a man who had never truly been in a fight. At the last second, Chuck pivoted, his hands snapping out to seize the boy's shirt. He used the young man's own weight against him, turning and sending him sprawling headfirst into the dirt. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and he lay coughing, clutching at his chest as if the ground itself had betrayed him. They were all down again, groaning, spitting curses into the night. But the fight was not over. Pride would not let them yield. Chuck could feel it radiating from them, that burning humiliation that begged for violence as a salve. He stayed loose, ready, his stance relaxed yet unbreakable, the calm of a man who had walked this road many times. The gunman forced himself up once more, cradling his wrist but refusing to back down. "You're dead," he hissed, his voice trembling with both rage and fear. He fumbled at his waistband, pulling free a second pistol, smaller, hidden away as a last resort. For a moment the barrel glinted beneath the moonlight, raised shakily but aimed with deadly intent. Chuck's eyes narrowed. In a flash, his body reacted. He stepped forward, his foot striking upward in a perfect, controlled arc. The kick met the weapon with pinpoint precision, sending it flying from the man's hand before his finger could tighten on the trigger. The gun soared into the night and landed somewhere in the brush with a faint metallic thud. Chuck's follow-through carried his momentum forward, his shoulder crashing into the gunman's chest, knocking him flat once more. The man coughed violently, the air torn from his lungs, his eyes wide with shock. The broad one groaned and tried again to rise, but his knee buckled under his weight. Chuck caught him by the collar before he could collapse entirely, pulling him upright just long enough to deliver a controlled strike to his midsection. It wasn't enough to break ribs, but it was enough to fold him like paper, his breath leaving him in a sharp wheeze as he crumpled back into the dust. The one with the phone crawled backward, desperation now painted across his face. "Stop! Just stop!" he gasped, though even as he begged, his hands grasped for anything. A rock, a loose shard of asphalt, anything to hurl in defiance. Chuck's eyes fell on the trembling hands, and before the boy could act, Chuck knelt beside him, pinning his wrist to the ground with a grip like iron. "You don't fight with rocks," Chuck said quietly. You fight with discipline, and you have none." The boy's eyes filled with tears, his bravado finally breaking. The rock slipped from his grasp, clattering harmlessly to the dirt. For a moment, the desert was filled only with the sounds of their gasps and groans. The three of them, so eager to humiliate, so eager to prove themselves predators, now lay beaten, their strength revealed as nothing more than posturing. Chuck stood over them, his breathing measured, not a hair out of place. He hadn't used everything he knew. He hadn't needed to. What he had given them was a lesson, brutal in its simplicity. Arrogance is not power, and cruelty is not control. The broad one rolled onto his back, clutching his stomach, his voice hoarse. You don't know who we are," he rasped, though the words carried no weight anymore. Chuck looked down at him, his expression hard as stone. "I don't care who you are. You made your choice tonight, and now you live with it." The gunman coughed, clutching his chest, his second weapon lost to the brush, his first still under the truck. He glared up, but the fury in his eyes was hollow now, the mask of a boy who had been broken by the man he thought he could dominate, the one with the phone curled into himself, the glow of the device long gone, the audience he had imagined now nothing more than shadows. His voice shook as he muttered curses into the dirt, each one weaker than the last. Chuck did not advance further. He stood calm, his posture relaxed, his hands open at his sides. He had no need to strike again. They were finished, though they hadn't yet admitted it to themselves. The fight had been theirs to start, but it was his to end, and he had ended it cleanly, decisively, with the precision of a man who understood violence better than they ever would. The desert night closed in around them once more. The stars shone cold and distant, indifferent to the struggle that had played out beneath them. Chuck glanced toward the horizon, where the faint glow of the highway lights shimmered far in the distance. He knew the lesson hadn't yet sunk in for them. Pride was stubborn, and fear only sometimes reshaped it. But the silence now was different. It was heavy, thick, laced with the reality of defeat. Chuck's gaze returned to the three young men sprawled across the ground. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, the readiness for another attack. But as he watched them writhe and whimper, he saw that the fight had drained from them. They were broken, not in body. That would heal, but in spirit, at least for tonight. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, his mind already moving beyond the violence. Yet he did not let his guard fall. The lion had not left. It was only resting. If they dared to rise again, he would be ready. And in the silence of that desert road, with his truck behind him and three would-be predators at his feet, Chuck Norris stood as unyielding as the land itself, knowing with absolute certainty that the real lesson was yet to come. The night was thick with silence now, heavier than the dust that clung to the roadside, heavier than the scent of blood and sweat that lingered around the three young men groaning in the dirt. The fight had ended. The storm had passed. But in its wake, there was something even more oppressive than the violence itself. The realization of what they had unleashed and what they had lost. Chuck stood among them, his chest rising and falling with steady breath, his body relaxed yet coiled with the quiet strength of a man who knew he could unleash more if he wished, but chose restraint. The fight had been his to end, and he had ended it. But now came something else. Now came the lesson. The broad-shouldered one writhed on his back, clutching his ribs with both arms, his jaw clenched against the pain. His earlier bravado had shattered like glass under a boot. The one with the phone lay on his side, coughing weakly, his hands trembling as he pressed them to the gravel, trying and failing to push himself upright. The gunman sat propped against the fender of the truck, one arm wrapped around his injured wrist, the other across his chest where Chuck's shoulder had driven the air from his lungs. His glare remained, but it was hollow now, filled with the brittle remnants of pride and the realization that it had brought him nothing but humiliation. Chuck's boots crunched softly on the gravel as he stepped between them, not with menace but with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to prove anything further. His shadow stretched long across the ground in the light of the SUV's headlights, falling over the three broken figures like the shadow of judgment itself. He crouched slightly, his voice calm, low, but carrying the weight of command. "You thought this was power," he said, his words deliberate, steady, each syllable like the strike of a hammer on an anvil. You thought holding a gun, ganging up on someone, mocking a man you didn't know that made you strong. But it doesn't. It never has. Power without discipline is just violence, and violence without honor is nothing. The boy with the phone shook his head, his lips trembling. We were just messing around, he stammered, his voice cracking like dry wood. It was just a joke, man. Just a joke. Chuck's eyes fixed on him, unflinching. A joke is something you laugh at with friends. What you did tonight was put a gun to a man's side and threaten to end his life. That's not a joke. That's cowardice. And if you don't learn that difference, you'll spend the rest of your life hurting people weaker than you, telling yourself you're in control when really you're just a scared kid pretending to be dangerous. The boy's eyes welled with tears, and he lowered his head to the dirt. Chuck turned to the broad one, who tried to muster anger even as his face twisted with pain. You thought numbers would make you strong, Chuck said, his voice tightening like a vice. You thought 3 against 1 was enough, but numbers don't make men strong. Character does, and tonight you showed none. The broad one spat into the dust, his pride still clinging desperately to defiance, though the sound was weak. You think you're better than us? He rasped, his breath shallow. Chuck's gaze hardened. No, he said. I don't think I'm better. I know I made better choices. That's what separates us tonight. Not age, not strength. Choices. He stood again, his full height looming over them, his voice now cutting through the night like a blade. I could have broken you, any of you. I could have left you in pieces out here on this road and let the coyotes finish the rest. But I didn't, because I know something you haven't learned yet. Real strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about knowing when to stop. The gunman shifted against the truck, his face pale, his pride clinging like a man clutching at the edge of a cliff. You think you scared us? He croaked, his voice trembling. This doesn't end here. You'll see. We'll come back. Before he could finish, Chuck was in front of him. Not fast, not violent, just there. His presence overwhelming, his eyes locked on the young man's with the cold intensity of a predator. He crouched low, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to echo louder than any shout. You're alive right now because I let you be, Chuck said. Don't mistake mercy for weakness. You talk about coming back, about revenge. But if you try, if you even think of putting another gun in your hand for something like this, you won't walk away next time. Do you understand me? The boy's bravado crumbled in an instant. He looked away, unable to hold the stare, his lips pressing together as though to keep from trembling. Chuck rose again, exhaling slowly, his shoulders easing back. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers calm as he dialed. His voice when he spoke was flat, professional, the tone of a man who had seen countless nights like this. County Sheriff's Office, he said when the dispatcher answered. This is Chuck Norris. I'm on Route 17 just west of Oak Creek. 3 armed suspects attempted an assault. They've been subdued. Send units. He ended the call without waiting for questions. The 3 men looked at him with wide eyes, disbelief flickering across their battered faces. The boy with the phone swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he muttered, You called the cops? Chuck turned to him, his expression unreadable. Actions have consequences, he said simply. You thought you could hide behind fear, behind weapons, behind a camera. Now you'll face something you can't laugh away or fight off. The broad one groaned, shaking his head. We'll get out of this, he said through clenched teeth. We always do. Chuck's gaze lingered on him, steady, immovable. Not this time. Tonight you crossed a line. Tonight you picked the wrong man. And tonight, whether you like it or not, your lives change. The desert was quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This silence carried weight, the heavy pause of judgment rendered and fate sealed. The 3 men, once so loud and mocking, now sat in the dirt, broken, waiting for the flashing lights they knew were coming. Chuck walked back to his truck, placing one hand gently on the hood, feeling the warmth of the metal still lingering. He looked out across the horizon, the faint red glow of taillights and the shimmer of stars above. His voice, when he spoke again, was not for them, but for the night itself. Strength without honor is just destruction, and I don't let destruction pass. Behind him, the three young men said nothing. For the first time that night, they understood silence too. The silence stretched long after Chuck had ended the call, an oppressive quiet that seemed to settle into the skin of the three men crouched and broken on the roadside. Their heavy breathing punctuated the night, raw and uneven, like the panting of animals who had been run to exhaustion. The desert, indifferent as ever, returned to its natural rhythm, the chirp of crickets, the low whisper of wind curling through the sagebrush, the faint rustle of unseen creatures moving in the dark. But above it all, there was the unshakable awareness of consequence. The fight was over, their pride was gone, and the weight of what awaited them grew heavier with every tick of the clock. Chuck stood near the front of his truck, his silhouette outlined by the harsh glow of the SUV's headlights. He didn't need to watch them. They weren't going anywhere. He knew the sheriff's deputies would be here soon. He also knew that for the first time in a long while, these three had been forced to look at themselves as they were. Not predators, not men, not rulers of the night, but frightened boys playing with matches in a dry forest. He had given them a glimpse of the fire they had dared to spark, and it had nearly consumed them. The gunman shifted against the fender, his hand still cradling his injured wrist. His eyes flicked toward Chuck, but the glare he tried to summon faltered when it met the older man's calm, steady gaze. He turned away quickly, biting back a groan, as if the refusal to admit pain could undo the humiliation already seared into him. The broad one lay in the dirt, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, every movement betraying the sharp ache in his ribs. His face twisted in a scowl that was meant to be defiant, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, yes, but something more than fear. Respect, perhaps, though he would never speak it aloud. The one with the phone was the most broken, trembling as he hugged his knees to his chest, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Every so often he muttered under his breath, as if talking to himself might undo the reality of what he had recorded before his device was knocked into the dark. In the distance, faint at first but growing clearer, came the sound of sirens. The wailing cry echoed across the empty desert road, bouncing off the scrub and the stones, drawing closer with every passing second. Red and blue lights soon flickered against the far horizon, piercing the blackness of the night like distant stars being dragged toward the earth. The three boys turned their heads toward the sound, each reaction different. The broad one cursed under his breath, grinding his teeth against the inevitability of what was coming. The gunman closed his eyes, leaning back heavily against the truck, as though the weight of gravity had finally won its fight against him. The one with the phone whimpered, his entire body shaking as he realized there was no way out. No story he could tell that would erase what had happened here. Chuck watched them all silently, his face unreadable. He had seen men in war react the same way when capture loomed, the same shuffling between pride and fear, between defiance and collapse. He knew there was nothing left for him to say. He had already spoken his last word. Now it was time for the law to take over. The sheriff's cruisers pulled up with a roar of engines, dust swirling in the sudden rush of movement. The desert road was lit in an instant with a strobing flash of red and blue. Doors opened and officers spilled out, hands on holstered weapons, their voices barking commands that shattered the fragile quiet. "Hands where we can see them! On the ground now!" The three young men didn't resist. Whatever fire had lived in them was extinguished completely. The broad one raised his hands shakily, wincing as he did so, before dropping flat onto the dirt. The gunman slid down from where he leaned against the truck, lying prone with his cheek pressed to the gravel. The one with the phone simply curled tighter into himself until an officer hauled him to his feet and spun him around, snapping cuffs onto his wrist with a sharp metallic click. Chuck stayed where he was, his palms visible at his sides, his expression calm. One of the deputies approached cautiously, squinting against the glare of the SUV's lights. Recognition dawned as he drew closer, and the tension in his stance dissolved almost immediately. "Mr. Norris," the deputy said, his voice tight with surprise, "we got the call. You all right?" "I'm fine," Chuck answered evenly. "They're not, but they'll live." The deputy's eyes flicked to the three suspects now being restrained by his fellow officers. There was no confusion about who had been the aggressors. The guns retrieved from the roadside, the bruises on the young men, the arrogance drained from their faces. It told the story plainly. The deputy gave a short nod, his respect unspoken but clear. "Appreciate the call," he said. "We'll take it from here." Chuck inclined his head, nothing more. He wasn't here for gratitude, he wasn't here for praise. He was here because men like those three thrived in silence, in moments when no one stood up to them. Tonight, they had been reminded that silence could be broken. As the officers secured the suspects in the back of the cruisers, the desert once again filled with the hum of engines and the chatter of radios. The flashing lights painted the scene in harsh, shifting colors, red and blue sweeping across Chuck's face as he walked slowly back to his truck. His boots met the gravel with steady rhythm, each step echoing the certainty that what needed to be done had been done. He opened the driver's side door, pausing for a moment as his hand rested on the frame. He glanced back once, just once, at the three young men being guided into the cars, their heads bowed, their wrists bound. There was no malice in his gaze, no gloating, only the cold clarity of truth. He hoped they would remember this night, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Perhaps humiliation would seed wisdom where arrogance had once reigned. Perhaps. The deputies climbed into their cruisers, the radios crackling as they prepared to depart. One of them raised a hand toward Chuck, a gesture of acknowledgement, and Chuck returned it with a small nod before sliding into the cab of his truck. The interior smelled faintly of dust and leather, the seat worn into familiar grooves that fit him like an old glove. He started the engine, the low growl rumbling steady beneath him. Outside, the sirens dimmed as the cruisers pulled away, carrying their prisoners toward a night that would not end with laughter or pride, but with bars and steel doors. Chuck shifted into gear, his eyes on the road ahead. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a long ribbon of black asphalt under the indifferent stars. He drove slowly at first, letting the weight of the evening settle into his bones, letting the calm return after the storm. The wind through the open window carried the scent of sage again, cooler now, gentler, as if the desert itself approved of what had passed. He didn't look back again. There was nothing left behind him worth seeing. What mattered was the road in front of him, the silence he carried with him, the knowledge that he had done what he was meant to do. He wasn't searching for fights. He never had. But when the fight came to him, when arrogance turned to violence and cruelty turned to threat, he would always answer. The night embraced him as he drove, the flashing lights of the sheriff's cars fading into the distance until they were nothing but a memory. Alone again with the hum of his pickup and the endless stars above, Chuck Norris returned to the quiet he had begun with, the quiet he had earned. The desert road carried him home, and behind him the echoes of a lesson that would not soon be forgotten lay heavy in the dust. If this story gripped you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next jaw-dropping story. Check out the other videos on the channel. Everyone is packed with twists you won't see coming. And share this video with friends and family. You never know who needs to hear this story tonight.